Hello,
Got it.
welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Du, and today I'm joined again by Mike Buhl. Welcome to the podcast. Um,
Thank you, Larry.
so you
Glad to
you
be
were
here.
you were just starting with a Neckel piece,
Yeah.
and he talks about the emissions of the rich people. So just maybe
Yeah.
repeat the argument again for the
Well,
audience.
for our listeners, and Sieghart Nickel is a German sociologist based out of Hamburg University, and I've really have been fascinated with a lot of his works. And this recent article that he published, right now it's in German. He kind of takes this approach in looking at climate change and environmental pollution from the perspective of a kind of ecological class war, and using statistics and illustrating the kind of emissions that the super elite produce and the really rich, particularly their lifestyles and the cars and the mobility. And so he kind of goes into this, I would say, ecological leftist perspective, where he's arguing we need to look at class war from a kind of ecological class war. And that's basically the gist of the article. I like the title of it in German. It's Zerstörerischer Reichtum, right? Wie eine globale Verschmutzerelite das Klima ruiniert, and it's published out of Blätter. Blätter. It's April edition, so this came out just recently. So I don't know. I thought we might discuss it, or if there's something there to be discussed. When we look at environmental pollution and the impact class has, social class, lifestyles of people, and
Yeah, for
consumer
instance,
behavior.
there's a
Yeah,
very cynical way of looking at, you could say the Davos elite, right? Because they are the people that talk about, the Great Reset, which includes, a carbon-free future. It's about, I don't know, eating less meat, or it's about, electrifying the public transportation and the manufacturing system, which would presumably reduce the um, total, level of carbon emissions. But then the fact
right.
that they're using airplanes to fly into
Fly.
Davos,
It's
um,
cynical, right? Contradictory.
and they're not using like public, airplanes. Well, the journalists might be, but certainly not the elites like the CEOs and the heads of governments, because they usually get in with like a private jet, right?
Right.
Charter jets and so forth.
Learjets
Um,
and stuff.
yeah, so
Yes.
there's a little bit of an irony in that. Um, but for me, it's still a little bit of a cheap shot argument, because I would still
Right.
say that as long as the government leaders that are meeting in those venues, as long as they are making a decision to, reduce carbon emissions eventually, um, it doesn't bother me as much if, if they're using airplanes to get to that, space, that conference venue.
Right.
So the macro level policies have to go in the right
Reflect.
direction, and then we can sort of, well, not ignore, the hypocrisy in what they're doing, but just, you know see it as the cost of, that, green energy transition, right?
Mhm.
um but yeah, I mean, but the overall argument, yes, it is very much true. I mean, that the richer you are, I mean, the more carbon emissions you're going to produce. um
Yeah. Lifestyle. Yeah. Cars and private pools in the back. I mean, I think I'm coming from a Texas kind of perspective. I mean, in more affluent neighborhoods, if you think about the number of cars, I'm going to make an estimate. I think maybe if you are an upper class household, you probably have 3 to 4, maybe 5 cars, SUV. You probably will have a large pool outside, probably take regular trips outside of your state. So I could see where people might make that argument that there's an ecological kind of class war happening, and the true, emission people that produce most of the emissions are the more affluent, right? So that kind of fits with Veblen's original what conspicuous consumption idea, right? So I don't know. I'm still rereading this article. I'm trying to verify some of the statistics, but for right now, I thought that's okay. Maybe it's an unfair argument, but I'm looking at it from a perspective where I live currently, and I'm kind of seeing the ecological kind of damage, uneven ecological damage.
Yeah, I had
Texas is a
this.
special place. I don't know about other places, so
Well,
yeah.
I did saw a U.S. map of private swimming pools,
Mhm.
and it is regionally concentrated. So we're talking like California,
Mhm.
Arizona, and
Florida,
Florida. I mean,
Florida.
yeah,
Yeah.
those are places that are very sunny. It's very warm most of the year. It's definitely feasible, viable, and it makes economic sense to invest in a swimming pool. Um, and I can
Uh,
also see this whole idea of wanting to buy a big property, right, with a huge backyard where you can put the pool. Because if you consider, like, I mean, growing up in a European country, especially if you grow up in a city, like I did, you know, like living in anything other than like a small apartment is is a strange idea, right? I mean, it never crossed my mind to want to live in a house. And then when I came over to the States, parents bought a house, and then I'm like, okay, all right. So now I know the other experience.
Leisure. Yeah. Different
Yeah.
lifestyle.
But I
Yeah.
still think, I mean, on balance, I mean, it sounds like more stressful to me to own a house actually,
Yeah.
because you have to worry about cutting the grass, which I
Yeah.
didn't have to do when I was living in an apartment building. You're responsible for shoveling the snow, which you don't have to worry about
In Texas.
in an apartment building because because I lived in municipal housing, so there were municipal workers that would shovel the snow.
Right.
Um, and also like with the trash collection, I mean, you have to worry about specific times, like once a week. Even over here in Princeton, we have to do that. While in Vienna, basically you have in these public apartment complexes in the social housing units, you have designated spaces for the trash, um, and you can basically throw away your trash whenever you want to because the trash collectors, they would come once a day, usually in the
Mm.
morning, and they would pick up the trash for the entire basically block of the housing units. Um, So yeah, so you didn't have to worry like when to throw it all or not, right? So uh
So I guess in Vienna, there's also encouraging people to recycle, right? So you have recycling initiatives, and is it by law? You have to like they will look through your trash if you didn't. You have to separate it, right? I guess. Is
well,
that the
yeah, so the
case in Vienna?
separation. So you have paper, you have
Yeah.
plastic, you have glass bottles, and then you have a general trash. Um, but in a sense, I mean, like, there's no way to check up on you though, right? Because you basically throw away the trash at your own leisure. And
Yeah.
I mean, I would sort of kind of go the lazy way out, where basically you just put everything into like a large black trash bag, and then, which of course is not transparent, right? So you just seal it up, and then you throw it into the general trash. Um, And because I mean, it's a big question about like how effective is the recycling, anyways. I mean, how much of it ends up in the general waste dump, anyways. I'm sure there's some effective recycling to be done, but um, I mean, the bigger problem I would say is the waste culture in general, right? The fact
Yeah,
that our culture, our industrial society, produces so
wasteful.
much, trash. But then I
Illegal
also ask
dumping.
myself,
Yeah. I was saying illegal dumping too is the problem. Illegal dumping of just dumping it everywhere. I don't know how bad it is in Princeton, New Jersey, where you're at, but
yeah, well, what they did over here is they gave us these new general trash bins, which
yeah.
are like the big black ones that have like the cover on top. And I suppose that's nice because it's sort of standardizes it. It makes it easier for the garbage collectors to pick it up and dump it into the truck. Um, but but yeah, I mean the main problem that we're facing in industrial society is that we are producing too much trash now, and a lot of it is related to food consumption. Now the problem is like how are you going to get your milk, if not in a carton,
Yeah.
or in some cases people can get glass bottles. um yeah, in the old days they would have these glass bottles which is brought by the milkman,
Yeah.
and when you finish
1950s, I think.
the
Yeah.
milk then you would put like the empty glass bottle outside of your house and the milkman would pick it up the next day, right? So you could continuously refill it. um I mean, one thing that I would find interesting, because for a lot of packaging, um now I'm not talking about like messy foods, like I don't know, like think of meat for instance. I mean, you used to work as a meat worker, right? Processing
Yeah,
worker.
yeah.
So, um, yeah, that would be a little bit more messy. We might have to throw that one out. But for a lot of like dry items, you know, isn't it not possible to take those empty packages, send them back to the manufacturer and then
Recycler.
recycle, and then reuse it,
Yeah.
basically.
I always understood that for many manufacturers, the cost factor would it's to make it cheaper for them is to produce this throwaway material. You could see that kind of like with McDonald's logic, like even I go to a McDonald's nowadays or a fast food, United States, this heavy packaging, and because there aren't laws to, that punish it or restrict it, unlike in Europe, there's laws. Uh, I think in the US, you have this tendency to think of throwaway. Everything is a throwaway. Everything is in plastic, throwaway plastic, and there's no punishment for the polluter, including the producer who might be the polluter. So yeah, unless they have some policy, precautionary policy, or some laws, creating a higher tax on it, tax on such wastes or payment, then people are going to keep doing it, and I think businesses will keep doing it. If there's no mechanism that stops them, right? So yeah,
Yeah, it's a cost factor, right?
yeah,
So making it unviable. I mean, the trouble is also like, I mean, if you wanted to get the customers, um, like the conscientious ones, who wanted to send back the empty packages, first of all, I mean, even the trouble to go through like the shipping process, which you might have to
yeah,
pay yourself, and then you have to go to the postal service, you have to stand in line,
yeah.
doing that. I mean, it's sort of like, who wants to do that kind of thing, right? So
Very inconvenient,
um
yeah,
yeah,
inconvenient, yes.
it's a great degree of inconvenience. Or you could just bring it back to the supermarket, but then the
Yeah,
supermarket would have then the challenge of figuring
yeah.
out a cost effective way to uh bring it back to the manufacturers. So you
Yeah,
would actually have to double the truck workforce, right? People
mhm.
that because half of them would have to deliver the ware to the store, and half of them would have to carry the empty bins
Yeah. Waste and all that.
vessels back to the manufacturer, right? So um,
Yeah, it's at some point, I don't know. I'm with Ulrike Herrmann. Uh, she would say just ban it. You know? You have to ban, you know, at some point you have to ban certain things. So I don't know how that would go with trash. But you know what, you lived in Europe like I have. There's a point where you do have to ban certain kind of packaging, or you have to uh otherwise, yeah, it will continue. The practice will continue. So I'm really amazed that, I mean, if you think about how milk is still predominantly packaged in the US is plastic. Everybody's familiar with a gallon of milk, but even when I lived in Europe, they have kind of recyclable cartons, I guess, and they don't have those big gallon jugs of milk like we have here in US. So definitely more consciousness about recycling and environmentally friendly packaging, things like this would be good.
yeah, I mean, I
But I
would
do think,
say
yeah, go ahead.
outright bans sounds very difficult to me,
I know.
because then I mean you're not solving the fundamental issue, right? Where the consumers still need some kind of vessel in which
Yeah,
the food that they're eating is being transported. Um, I mean, if you think about sort of like the low environmental impacts, low waste producing
yeah,
way would be being a farmer. So you would have to be um, like, I mean, if for instance you get your eggs directly from the chicken, right? So you don't even need to have egg holders that ship the eggs to the supermarket to, right?
mm,
Or if you want, you grow your own vegetables, so you cut down whatever the cucumbers that you were growing, and then you carry them straight to your kitchen and cut it up, right? Um,
mm,
so that would basically be the lowest impact way. Now the problem is that most of us are not farmers, right? So
no.
now I have no idea how to grow
Maybe we
food.
should be though. Maybe we need to bring that back. Right? Bring back farming, right? Why not? I'm for it.
Bring back farming, yeah. Um, well, I mean, I used to have a professor back in undergraduate days, and he said that this whole urban gardening movement sounds to him like it is privileged people who are able to do these kinds of activities.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, that's
um,
true.
and yeah, so it doesn't sound realistic as sort of at the mass scale. I think if you're sort of a working class person, I mean, you don't have, you know, the backyard. You don't even have,
Time, time.
yeah, you don't have the time at your disposal to be growing your own food. So there's a lot to be said about convenience. But then the issue is like, I mean, I know that you produce even more plastic waste. Let's say if you get takeout food primarily from restaurants, right? Because all of that, styrofoam, all the plastic
Plastics, yeah.
material, um, you're going to use it once, then you throw it away, right? Carelessly.
Mhm.
Um, so it's even there. I mean, maybe supermarket food might be slightly better, right? But it's only slightly because it's like you have one meat, you still have got this one meat package, right? That carried your meat, but then you might be consuming that over several meals, right? 4 or 5 meals.
Yeah,
So you're just reducing the amount of packaging, but you're not eliminating it either, right?
yeah.
Uh,
It's a dilemma. Yeah, definitely.
yeah, but I guess that gets us back to the nickel point, right? That
Yeah.
we are being over consumers, especially in the wealthy developed countries. Now, but then I spoke recently to a sociologist from Sweden, Johan Zandberg, and he worked in also development sociology, development economics for a long time, and he has been to you know, third world, you could say, or global south villages, where there's discussions about what's the best developmental strategies. Um, and he says, if they had the choice to basically develop the economy and then thereby drive up the carbon emissions because production would have to increase, right? So the carbon footprint would go up. But then you're able to solve other problems that they're facing, chiefly regarding survival, chiefly
Yeah.
regarding malnutrition, right?
Food, yeah.
Yeah, food supplies, medicine supplies, which of course, in order to buy medicine, you need to have money, right? Things like that. So that most poor people, even in the global south, they want to obtain the material standard of living that the Western countries have already. Um, but then, of course, it does put us in a dilemma, right? So, if you have, let's say, currently, let's say if the global middle class right now is, say, 20-25% of the population
Yeah.
globally, um, if we bumped it up to 75, 80%, up to 100% at some point, through the diffusion of technology and economic progress, um, we are talking about substantially increased ecological footprint.
Yeah,
Um,
damage. Yeah.
yeah, also considering that we haven't maxed out on the population yet. There's still some growth areas in sub-Saharan
Yeah.
Africa.
We're right now at
Um,
8 billion, right? Globally, 8 billion
yeah, we're at
population.
yeah, we're more than 8
8
billion, I
billion.
think, at this point. The big news in demography, I think you followed that, is that India
India. Yeah.
has overtaken China. Um, and I did read a BBC article that suggested that the statistics are a little bit unclear,
Mm.
meaning that the Indian census is not as reliable, perhaps, as in the more developed countries. So,
Hmm.
so it's a big
So
question
that's
whether,
it's
uh,
accurate.
yeah, right. So, well, what we know for sure is that there's going to be a takeover vis-a-vis China. The question is, when is it reached? Has it already been reached at the beginning of this year? Has it been reached right now? Is it going to be reached at the end of this year? Um, so it's a certainty that India is going to overtake China. It's a question of precisely when that happens. Um, but I would say probably with a lot of certainties within this year. Um, and yeah, yeah, so you were mentioning this
Months.
Lance show where he invited several experts, including
Oh
Raman
yeah,
Yeshwar.
Marco Suns had a great show. A couple of days.
Um,
Actually, it was maybe yesterday, I think, or day before yesterday. It's usually Tuesdays and Thursdays where the show was live. Yeah, but India was the topic as a new kind of superpower, that will definitely play a significant role and probably already has. And it might shift, you know, power balances, I guess. And with this new 1 billion, over 1 billion population, it's massive society and massive resource, also resource consumption, economics. I think they were talking about a lot of Western companies, including more Apple. Apple is going to open up a store in India. So yeah, so there's a lot of attention that was paid in the show on India, particularly India, and also some of the problems that India is facing, inequality, right? We still have poverty, child labor, conflict between religious ethnic groups, obviously the Hindu and Muslim. conflict, historical conflict in India. That all of that was mentioned in the show. I thought it was a good show, so I had a lot of takeaways. Uh, and the more I learn about India, is better also for me. But it's a massive country. It's so much history, colonial history, right? Political history, just amazing,
Yeah,
right?
just on
And
that
it,
one point, I think one of the guests was making the case that um, this sectarian conflict, right, between the Hindus and the Muslims, has really been, um, you know, inflamed through the British. Because I mean, it's quite interesting. Like, so when the British, well, they didn't rule the entire subcontinent all at once, right? So they gradually took over control over it. They started with Bengal, so around Calcutta, and then they gradually expanded their domains, basically by bribing some princely states, and then they were allying with others, and then the Mughal Empire effectively was defeated militarily by the British and their Indian allies. And but then nonetheless, I mean, the British, they were able to create a coherent empire effectively throughout the entire subcontinent. So there was no division at that point between you know the Muslim and the Hindu populations. Um, and uh, and then what happened was that by the time that the British left, they were sort of pushed out gradually with independence movement
yeah,
campaign by Mahatma Gandhi.
yeah, Gandhi, yeah.
Um, you know the sort of sectarian divisions, they started to become important all of a sudden. Um, so it was, you had the Muslim League, right, which was led by Ali Jinnah. Then you had the Indian National Congress, which was officially, secular, right, but then it was clearly Hindu dominated. And you had completely different visions about where the country should be going, and that's why you had the partition of India into the Republic of India, and then Pakistan, and then later
Mm.
Bangladesh, which used to be East Pakistan. Um, so so those communal divisions. I mean, there was always a distinction between Hindu and Muslim, but then making it into a, you could say, a relevant political category that then ultimately resulted in the political partition of the country. I think that was something that the British had sort of encouraged to some extent, uh,
Oh,
right?
interesting. Yeah,
Uh, and yeah, so this is a big trouble for sure. I mean,
yeah,
now,
yeah.
now,
There's. Go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
but are there any advantages that Indian society has today? Um, well, I think it does, right? I mean, I think that there's a population, so it's just, of course, that's the one big factor. Um, it has a very vibrant, you know,
Diasporas.
um, it has a very vibrant economic sector. I mean, I think we're talking
Yeah.
about the service industry, like Infosys, like IT support. Like the Swedish expert that I spoke to yesterday, Sandberg, um, was talking about the many Indian IT workers in Sweden. Actually, they're
Yeah.
enriching the Swedish labor market. So it's a big diaspora community there. Um, and I believe that um, is it Olaf Scholz? I mean, recently he said something about attracting more Indian IT workers
Yes,
into
they're working at with
Germany.
agreements and making it easier for those that like to work in Germany. that they could. Germany's definitely interested, definitely. But I would say, even in the United States, there's a large Indian diaspora. I mean, when I look at here in North Texas, we have a large Indian community, and so that's also something to consider. Communities and how much influence, India has, but also Indian immigrants into other countries and their connections, family connections, that so yeah, definitely I would say India is a major power player and economic, interest for a lot of countries to have stake in that country, right? I can imagine, I mean, even auto manufacturers, I mean, such a market, with 1 billion potential customers, if you have your company situated there, right? But I can imagine India will probably want to encourage also internal production and this made in India brand, that they want to also protect their domestic producers, because otherwise then you have this worry that the money's just being sucked out of India.
Yes,
So.
so part of the reason that Lance paid attention to India was because the Apple CEO Tim Cook recently traveled to New Delhi and
Mhm.
opened up the first Apple store in Delhi. And there is this discussion right now whether it is possible for Apple to strategically withdraw from China, which is one of the major hubs for manufacturing production for the assembly of the iPhones.
Move
And
it to India. Oh, okay.
Yeah, so
Huh.
there's discussion right now whether that is actually feasible or not. I mean, I had once a discussion with an engineering professor over here in Princeton, who said that it was difficult for a lot of engineering manufacturers um, to shift the production from East Asia to South Asia.
Yeah.
And part of the problem has to do with labor discipline, so which tends to be higher in the East Asian sphere than in the South Asian sphere,
Hmm.
and then the quality output is going to be is going to be an issue. Where because if you have less labor discipline, you're not going to be able to enforce uniform production standards across the plant,
Mhm.
and that actually forms somewhat of a deterrent to um, vastly increase manufacturing capacity in India. Um, so
So,
it's not going to be that simple. I mean, to be moving all of the production over to India, but there certainly are efforts in that direction. I believe that the
right.
Indians are. I saw the Wall Street Journal article. I mean, they're investing a lot in electrifying the cars. So you know there are quite heavy investments into, I guess, their version of auto, right? Which is it's kind of like a scooter, but
Hmm.
with three wheels, but it's got like a roof over the head. And this used to be like diesel engines, but now they're switching over to electrify them.
Oh, wow.
Um, yeah, so there's a lot of excitement certainly that is happening in the Indian sphere. I've had one of my friends yeah, who's been a researcher in Hyderabad in India,
Mhm.
um, and um, and he sort of studied life in like the tribal villages
Oh, wow.
in South India, um, and yeah, it's interesting, like what he reports. I mean, it's mostly about labor market disappointment as opposed to labor market success stories that we sort of hear about in the Western medias, right? Where he talks about people that are they thought they were doing the right thing, which is to obtain an education, but then they sort of recognize that. uh, that the education isn't bringing them the jobs that they wanted. So if you, I
Mhm.
mean, IT, I mean, it sounds like a promising sector, but there's not, but the IT sector, isn't growing as fast as they had hoped. Um, so a lot of these people would then have to be, rickshaw drivers. They'd have to be part of the informal economy. They'd have
Mhm.
to sell fruits on the
On the
street and so forth.
streets.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So and sort of negotiating with this kind of you know disappointment in the labor market is sort of one of the things that my friend focuses on. Um, and yeah, so but it's a very exciting. I mean, it's such a big country, right? I mean, I mean, even if you have
Yeah.
like a case study of those tribal villages, I think that it's only captures a small part of you know the dynamic story of the entire country.
Well, Larry, maybe a listener is listening and they could offer us visitor professorships. I would definitely go, but I would even go even if it wasn't job related for 6 months or something. I would love to explore, India and such an amazing country, amazing history, right? So much history and definitely. Yeah. So maybe a listener is listening and they could, send them an email so we can,
So you can go on a brief research trip ourselves. I
yeah,
mean,
a little
maybe just
research tip, definitely. I would
um,
do
yeah,
it.
yeah, just learning about how life is structured over there. I mean, for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
I sort of have a little bit of a personal connection there. I mean, to Indian
You know,
sphere because
a
my
related
family.
topic. The only thing I guess I'm kind of worried about is the impact of global warming, the temperatures, and the deaths. A lot of the in the summers there, apparently they have serious problem with air conditioning and I hear, that at least last summer it was really bad in major cities in India that they had deaths.
Even this summer,
Yeah.
the spring is bad
Yeah, that's
too.
the only thing. I mean, concern of this climate change is having on the global south particularly, and this yeah risks, health risks and such. Um,
Yeah,
so
I saw like a news report, which was specifically about, like how do the Indians deal with excessive heat, and so they have like these like cooling houses, you could call them maybe. I mean, where
Cooling houses, okay.
cooling houses, yeah. So essentially, it's about having some spaces. I mean, some of the spaces are air conditioned, but I mean, a lot of them are, um, they just have like the fans running all the time, right? And then they were even showing how so they have these beds, because because a lot of people that are going there. I mean, it's kind of like it's almost like a heat clinic, right? I mean, it's like, oh my God, it's too hot for you, and then you lie down over there. But then you actually see a lot of people that prefer to lie on the ground because the ground marbling actually is cooler than if you lie on the bed, right?
Really? Huh.
So and then the other thing that they showed in the report was the ice salesman. So because if because for a lot of these like informal laborers, right, who are
Yeah.
like running a fruit stand or they're running
Street vendors, stuff like
yeah,
that.
like
Yeah.
any kind of street food that they're selling.
Yeah.
um
Which is amazing, by the way, to watch on YouTube.
yeah, but
In
then
Mumbai or yeah, all the major Indian cities, people that produce food just on the side of a road. It's amazing, cheap too, by the way.
yeah, but what's interesting is that obviously there's no refrigerators. So
Mhm.
but some of the food, because I mean, especially like if you're selling seafood, for instance, right? I mean, you basically need a constant supply of ice. And the ice melts very quickly too, because I mean, if it's extremely hot outside, right? So you have these um, ice vendors effectively, and they would, you have like basically like buckets.
Uh,
That but they're I guess they're filled up first with water, and then you kind of put them into like a freezer, kind of,
hmm.
and then you take them out, and then you put them on the rickshaw or on the back of the van or whatever. And then you go around to the street vendors, and then you sell them like a block of ice. Um, and that's like a very much a thriving business. Um, and then the issue is, okay, well, a lot of people as vendors are still complaining. They're like, if you give me the ice, it melts so quickly. Is there something I can do about it? And the ice vendor says, buy more ice, right? That's
Yeah, that's somebody needs to do research on that. That'd be kind of interesting. Ice, the whole ice business. I know here in Texas, by the way, that in the summer, ice is a business. There's independent ice vendors, there's 24-hour ice truck services. They will have issues sometimes, even in restaurants here in Texas, and I assume in Arizona and New Mexico, that they have this problem of keeping the food cool and beer and drinks. So ice becomes one of those commodities which you can make a lot of money off of. And now I'm thinking in the global south, uh, that's like a lifeline. I mean, because that can probably melt into water, I mean, and you have other ways that you can use ice. So yeah, I'm wondering to what extent more and more multinational corporations are, also getting in the ice business. Or I know they're getting involved in the water business, but I don't know about the ice. It might be interesting. Do a little research on that. Because you got to have the technology to produce the ice on a massive scale. So I wonder if there's, markets or companies that are involved in that, particularly because, it's getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and a lot of money to be made. Definitely.
yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I think ice is a big business. And yeah, and then the other issue that we're seeing, I saw this one report which was about, yeah, water shortages, right?
Yeah.
Because obviously you need to draw deeper and deeper with the water tables. Eh, you need to. It's getting harder and harder to extract the water, right, from the ground. The water tables are declining. I mean, part of it has to do with the population pressure, growing population, but I think a big part of it is that it gets so warm that
Yeah. It
it's
dries
going to have
up.
a lot of water evaporation for sure. I mean, especially if it's
Yeah.
closer to the topsoil, right?
Well,
Um,
Larry, let me ask you, I mean, with this 1 billion population, yeah, it's
1.4.
the estimate, India. I mean, I'm thinking, what risks do you think exist? I mean, not just from a water resource standpoint, food, uh, I guess sustainable living in cities. That's always been a question because a lot of the cities in India have been overcrowded. And I wonder if there has. I mean, what impact do you think this 1 billion population will have on present day infrastructure of India? I mean, the cities, the resources. I mean, is it manageable, or do you think it poses risks?
Well, I still think there's like a good news
Yeah.
that comes out of well, not the things that you mentioned, but I
Uh-huh.
think out of the demographic projections, which is that, so
Yes.
first of all, the average Indian woman is about a little bit more than two children
Right.
per woman,
Fertility.
the fertility rate, yes. So that is a substantial decline, and we are seeing this across all of the religious groups. Traditionally, I think Muslim women tend to have more kids than the Hindu, but overall, I think we are seeing a decline in the overall rate of fertility. So it appears to me that the Indian population, at the very least, is stabilizing. That especially the people that are living in the cities that are very crowded with very high costs of living. We are
Population
seeing,
density. Yeah.
yeah, higher population density, and then competition for resources like housing, education, healthcare, things that are expensive. They of course they're driving down the fertility rate, especially in those regions, more strongly than the rural countryside. And that to me sounds like it is actually good news in the sense that the, the population, even though within the century it's going to continue to increase, it will top out at some point, probably within maybe at the end of our lifetime, I guess.
All right.
Um, so so I think it will eventually become manageable to India. Um, but yeah, I mean, short term, I mean, we're already seeing issues about how do you manage the scarce amount of resources.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, because I mean, waters, for instance, I mean, is not easily generatable, right? Um, but I'm still quite hopeful. I think
Okay.
there's people there, and they're going to be very creative. I mean, they're going to
Yeah.
figure
Very,
out how
very
to deal
creative.
with the resources. Um,
Definitely. Yeah.
yeah,
So we'll have to look and see. We'll have to watch next 10 years what happens. We'll see what happens, you know.
yeah. I think there'll be lots of creativity there. I mean, there's another point that Lance discussed was the foreign policy non-alignment of India, which I thought was
Right, right. Yeah, that was a big
quite
topic.
interesting because he and I spoke about this with Indian friends as well, and they would certainly concur with the official Indian government position,
Sure, right?
which is to not be aligned
Yeah.
with NATO or with Russia or with China. Or with China would be difficult because there's border disputes that are still ongoing. But overall, I think that the historical Indian position, since it obtained independence, now obviously as part of the British Empire, it was following British policy, which was to fight World War One and Two on the Allied side. But
Right.
after the independence in 1947, 48, um, the official Indian foreign policy stance has always been um, neutrality. Um,
Like Switzerland, right? Pretty much, in a way. Almost, no?
yeah, non-alignment.
Yeah.
Now, now you could go into the history books and then you could say, well, I mean, a lot of military equipment of the Indian army was purchased from the Soviet Union, so there was some
Oh,
relationship there versus
uh-huh.
the Pakistanis. They were supplied by the Americans. So generally, the Cold War tensions were also impacting the South Asian sphere. Um, but nonetheless, I think part of the reason why India is able to sort of withdraw from these, you could say, geopolitical tensions by the big Cold War countries, um, I think it has to do with the size, right?
Oh, big country.
In the sense that I mean, it's not. I mean, once the British were kicked out, I mean, it was clear that there wasn't going to be another round of foreign colonial conquest.
Yeah.
So it's actually very difficult for outsiders to push the Indians around. The size would make them strong enough to stand on their own, which is very
Definitely. Yeah.
different than if you take a smaller, vulnerable countries like I mean Sweden and Finland that are joining NATO, for
Uh,
instance, right?
they have nuclear arms too, right? I think India, yeah. Yeah, as far as we know, yeah.
Yeah, it's they
Yeah,
acquired nuclear
mm,
arms in the
yeah,
1990s.
yeah.
So at the same time that Pakistan acquired them.
Mhm.
And it's quite interesting that the last major war between India and Pakistan was the Kargil War in 1999. And that was right around the time when both sides were acquiring those nuclear weapons. So it suggests to me that the possession of nuclear weapons has actually reduced the heated tensions between the two sides. Um, because there's this area in Kashmir, right, in
Right.
north of India, and then the northeast of Pakistan, where there's continuous disputes over who gets to rule this area, um, and yeah, so those tensions are still there for sure.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I mean, so it's but yeah, the foreign policy orientation is non-alignment. We see this in particular with the heat in Eastern Europe. I mean, this war effectively has been ongoing for about 9 years now, but got really hot since last year. Um, and the West is always hoping, well, can we? Um, I mean, even if
A
China
partner.
is more on the hostile side vis-a-vis the West, I mean, is it possible to get the Indians to be more closely affiliated with the Western side? And it doesn't seem likely at all. I mean, and there's no geopolitical benefit for India to be partial in this Ukraine
Yeah.
war. Um,
It,
and,
it
and
will it will stay out then. It will stay out. It will just be neutral. Yeah, definitely.
yeah, I mean, and yeah, I mean, the advantage that for sure that India would have, I mean, if they were interested in taking on this role, would be to be, a foreign policy mediator in the conflict.
Mm.
There's not a lot of countries that would have that credibility to do it. I mean, certainly all of the Western countries, um, would lack the credibility at this point. Um, I mean, not even the Austrians. I mean, the Austrians are militarily neutral, but they are carrying all of the European Union sanctions against Russia, and they are providing significant amounts of humanitarian and non-lethal military aid to Ukraine.
Ammunition,
Um,
right? Isn't Austria providing ammunition? No, I can't recall. I read something. Not weapons, but ammunition, because Austria does have some uh,
so
gun
they're
manufacturing.
sending non-lethal military
Okay.
gear. So non-lethal, what does that mean? I guess it's helmets,
Okay.
flak jackets, yeah,
Yeah.
military uniforms, things like that.
Yeah.
Then like space heaters that you might need. I mean, but I guess during the winter season, for the soldiers who are camping outside, things like that.
Mm.
Um, so and then the other thing that the Austrian government recently did was they opened the country for transit for military gear
Mm.
because like the Italians, if they wanted to ship military gear overland, it would usually,
Be over Austria.
yeah, you go through Austria, then probably through Slovakia, and then or through the Czech Republic to Poland, and then that way it would enter Ukraine. Um, and yeah, so but anyways, so it's clearly not a purely neutral country. In any case, Brazil was sort of one of the other countries that sort of um also attempted to play this kind of mediating
Yeah, role.
role in the conflict. Um,
Lula, right?
yeah, Lula.
President
Yeah,
President
so
Lula.
Lula takes a very interesting position in my view. Because under Bolsonaro, I mean, if you remember, I mean, there was a very
Right
uh,
wing.
yeah, it's right wing, very strong alignment with the U.S. There was still a lot of cooperation in the business level with China, but because they're so dependent on China now, but at least on the rhetoric side, I think there was a closer alignment with the U.S. When Trump was still in power back then. But now I think that there has been a meeting between Biden and Lula, but this has been like if I guess a formal I guess meeting between the two big powers in the American hemisphere. But I think that the Lula visit to Beijing in China, and also in Shanghai, where the head of the BRICS Bank, the uh,
Mhm.
development bank, of the BRICS countries. I think that was sort of much more important. You could say visits. From Lula's standpoint.
Yeah.
The first well the current president of the BRICS Bank is the former president Dilma Rousseff.
Mm.
And Lula made clear in his speech that he wanted to have, you could say, an alternative to the US dollar as a global currency. Because right now, I mean, any country, you know, even if you don't do direct trade with the United States, I mean, you would be trading with the dollars. Dollars would have the credibility to clear payments. Um, and actually, I mean, I just saw this post this morning. It was about um, the yeah, so the Indians, they were importing military gear from Russia, interestingly, um, and they were holding the dollar payments in reserve to make those payments. But the Indians are fearful of the American sanctions. Now, the trouble is, I mean, obviously, like if you're using the US dollars, there's no way how you can escape the power of the US Treasury. So,
Yeah.
so then there's trouble because I mean, the only alternatives they would have is they could trade either in the rupees, the Indian currency, or they'd have to trade in the ruble, which is the
Oh,
Russian currency. But but neither side wants to take the other's currency.
so what do they do? Crypto or some alternative currency? What do they do instead? Like bartering or something?
Yeah, that would probably that's probably what would have to happen. But I mean, or they would have to cancel. They would have to diminish the amount of trade with each other. I mean, the thing that Russia would probably need in order to survive would be countries, intermediate countries that could help them bypass the sanctions. So, like a country like Central Asia, like the Kazakhstan, for instance,
Mhm.
Armenia, be Turkey. Though I recently saw that the Turks, they are no longer um, playing the transit country role for Russian trade. Um, and that's again, I think that the power of the U.S. Treasury is still quite significant. I mean, the ability to sanction countries and to apply secondary sanctions, basically to any countries that are using the dollar. I mean, and the dollar at this point is still the global
Dominant, huh?
reserve currency.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh,
and the Americans are using that club with uh, a lot of determination. Um, so, and then Lula's perspective is, whether BRICS
another
Bank
currency. Yeah.
would have an alternative currency. Now, the problem is, I mean, as we can see with the India-Russia disputes, the trade disputes, they can't agree on one. Um, it would probably make the most sense for the BRICS Bank to basically just trade in the yuan, the Chinese currency, because China would be definitely the biggest economy across the BRICS countries. Um, but there's still an issue about credibility ultimately, right? Where the Chinese government does not allow the yuan to be fully convertible. So you need to have a fully convertible currency. That's to say, like if I wanted to switch the yuan into any other currency, if I wanted to sell off all of my yuan all at once to obtain euros or dollars, I should be able to do so. Now, um, uh, the Chinese government doesn't want to have a fully convertible currency at this point, because they think that the government would lose control over monetary policy, which, like, if they're dealing with any kind of domestic housing property bubble or something where they needed to manipulate you know currency supply or something like that, or they needed to maintain the capital controls. Like if they, for instance, toughen the laws on, I don't know, certain kind of speculative activity, well, then if you had a fully convertible currency, what would happen is that a lot of capital would leave your country,
Yeah.
uh, because the investors are like, what the hell are you doing? I mean, you're
Mhm.
not allowing me to trade freely. So there's a lot of reasons why the Chinese would be not inclined to make it a fully convertible currency. Um,
Didn't know that. That's new to me.
yeah, but then
Yeah.
you're going to have issues because then the other countries, they don't want to hold the yuan in reserve either. Now the Russians are doing it increasingly now, so they're holding more of the yuan now in reserve. Um, uh, and of course they obtain the yuan because the Chinese, they still want to buy the Russian goods, right? Like the wheat, the oil, the gas, etc. Um, Now, if they did it under the dollar regime, which normally would be the case, there would probably be sanctions that would be applied to Chinese companies doing trade. Um, so using the yuan, which is now a currency that the Russians are now accepting as a form of
Uh-huh.
payment. That is a way for the Russia-China trade to continue,
And
um,
bypass sanctions. Yeah.
and bypass the sanctions. Yeah, obviously. Now the thing is that there might also be a limit as to like how far the Russians want to drive this, um, because they also don't like the fact that it's not a fully convertible currency. I mean, if they have the yuan, presumably what they could be doing is they could purchase goods in return from China, but they would be the captive buyers, right? They would basically be only usable for buying things from China instead
Yeah.
of being able to buy it from the world market from other countries, right? Um, there's not much choice at this point. I think that the Russians have made themselves a vassal state of China. Um, they're definitely the junior partners in this arrangement.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I
Do you
mean,
think
so
if things go south with Russia, I mean, if Russia ends up losing this war, hypothetically, that would also impact China? I mean, have some ramifications, or China will, will kind of not suffer or still go out on top. I mean, it's just trade. It wasn't really military involvement or anything like that. You know what I mean? Like hypothetically, if China loses this some way or fashion, and this would have consequences for
right, the Russians lost it.
Chinese currency, or yeah, yeah,
Well,
hypothetically, yeah, yeah. Go ahead.
if the I think if the Russians lose the war, I do think that the Chinese government regards this as a catastrophic outcome,
Yeah. Okay.
because so the big question mark right now is what you might call like a post-Putin Russia, right? So I mean,
Yeah.
if Putin gets toppled as a result of losing the war, um, what's going to be the successor government? I mean, it could very well be the case
Yeah.
that, well, I mean, in the case where there's chaos, if you had to break apart of the Russian Federation, that's what's called the Federation, right? Because there's a lot of
Yeah.
provinces in Russia.
separated
Um,
parts.
yeah, separated republics effectively. I mean, that could be problematic not just for China. I think it would be problematic for the entire world because you're talking about a nuclear power and who gets to assume the control over the nuclear code, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So that would be a global problem. The other issue that could arise is that if you have, let's say, the next government being pro-Western, right, that says explicitly, well, look, we lost the Ukraine war, we cannot defeat NATO. Um, we're going to have to be friendly with the NATO countries in order for Russia to survive. Um, Now, this would be an absolutely catastrophic outcome from the perspective of China.
Oh.
So the Chinese perspective, I mean, is well, basically, so they look at economic policy different from military policy.
Right.
This is the first thing. So the economic policy is like we want to have close relationships with other countries, right? The basically making them dependent on you for trading and financial debt and so forth. But when it comes to the military, they like to have the non-alignment status, right? Where it's this, I think, similar idea to India, where basically we're talking about a huge population, a huge country. 1 out of 7 people on this planet is Chinese, right? So the main idea being that, um, the China doesn't really need to have military alliances. Now, the problem is that, well, I mean, if the world was anarchic, right, you have like 200 nation states, and
Uh-huh.
like in a very Hobbesian way, I mean, every nation state for itself, it would probably be
State
following
of anarchy. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that would follow the vision that China has about the ideal world to be in. Um,
Yeah.
but
But
it's
it's
not.
not. Yeah, exactly.
So you have, you might call it like the US led coalition, right?
Yeah.
But basically take all of I mean, basically every country that's called Western, right? So basically Europe, um, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and then now there's some gray zone countries now. Interestingly, I mean, again,
It's
we're
my
talking about
periphery, right?
yeah, I mean, like
From
India being like non-aligned, but it's still part of like the
yeah.
Quad, right? Of like regional cooperation, right? And you have the Philippines and you have Vietnam. I mean, so there's some of the gray zone countries, but they're on the military side actually more favorable and closer to the U.S. alliance than to the Chinese one. Um, and China doesn't like that. And so right now, I mean, they feel they're under siege, right? So on all sides now. I mean, you got on the eastern side, you got Japan and South Korea. Um, in the western side, I mean, for a long time it was Afghanistan, and then of course the Taliban came in and kicked the Americans out. But um, I mean, yeah, but then you have India, which is sort of like somewhat hostile, right? Yeah, then you have any place like the Pacific where Americans have military bases, Indian Ocean where it's got bases, etc. And then if on top of that, I mean, imagine you have a pro-Western Russian government with a huge border going on the northern side uh, to China. Um, the the level of siege and encirclement that China acutely feels is going to be further intensified. And
Potential
that is,
conflict. Potential conflict, you think? Yeah.
yeah, it's an outcome that the Chinese do not want. I mean, again, as I said, they want to have a multipolar world where basically it's every country, every nation state for itself,
Mhm.
because they know that in this anarchic world system, they would be the top dog. It would be them, and then maybe the United States, and maybe Russia to some extent. But the sort of idea really is okay. You got these big powers, and they're going to decide on, you know, what global international relations are.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
and so yeah, so it would be quite bad if the Russians lost it. Now, in terms of like Ukraine by itself, I mean, I think that the Chinese are perfectly fine with Ukrainian sovereignty being restored. I mean, historically, I mean, the Chinese, they do have a sense of grievance in a similar way as the Indians for um, the period of like Western colonization, the seizing of Hong Kong, right, the seizing of Macau,
Mhm.
um, and then like the ports that were controlled by the Western countries plus Japan, um, the Opium War. I mean, so there's a lot of negative memories that the Chinese certainly have
Mhm.
about colonial history, and so they just see it as more of the same. I mean, there's more of the siege being potentially intensified. Um, so it's yeah, I think it's a complicated situation. Um, so earlier we were writing about the Baerbock's visit to Beijing,
Oh yeah,
right?
their book, Green
Um,
Minister,
yeah,
Green Party Foreign Minister.
the
There you
foreign
go.
minister, and her visit was quite momentous. I mean, obviously it happened
Yeah,
just a week or two after Macron's visit, the French president.
yeah.
Um, and so what is the we could say underlying motivation for both of them to travel to China? Um, well, first of all, I think part of it has to do with the fact that because China is just coming out of the COVID lockdown, they've had it for such a long time, um, and I mean you cannot have the second largest economy in the world, yeah, have no direct face-to-face interactions at the diplomatic level
Mhm.
for such a long time. Right?
Right.
It just was.
So it's symbolic too, I guess. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean
symbolic.
it's a catch up, right? That has to be done, I
Yeah.
believe, if you're acting within the world system, right? Now, but then at a deeper level, I mean, so there were different messages that these two leaders were bringing forth, right? So the Macron argument is to stake out that Europe is not a vassal state of America, interestingly. And of course, I mean, that message was specifically addressed at the Chinese, right?
Mhm.
Because if the French are marking out the Europeans as being separate entities from the United States, it means that they they being the Europeans would have the policy freedom
And to the side, yeah,
to be close to China if they wanted to.
yeah,
And then the second statement that Macron made was that Taiwan is considered to be a domestic affair of China. And that's, and basically, so Macron's argument is that it's the Americans who want to fight the Taiwan war if it gets to that. And the American interest is to pull in as many allies as they can into a hot conflict. So, including basically NATO. I mean, they want to have the European countries to be joining the Western alliance um, to defend Taiwan.
yeah,
Macron's perspective now, I think pretty clearly now, is to say that the Europeans don't want to be pulled into this conflict.
yeah.
That's to say, if the Americans were intervening in the Taiwan war, it would be without European support. And so now and then, so this was a clear message, and of course, the Chinese leadership likes to hear that. Now then,
Their book.
yeah. So within the German government, I mean, you have the two factions, the two foreign
Yeah.
policy factions. You have the Scholz wing, and then you have the Baerbock wing. Um, right. So I think the Scholz wing, they probably would have agreed with the Macron statement. I think they would be perfectly fine with that. Um,
Some reservations, right? Probably. So it's
yeah, I mean, but I
yeah,
mean,
a little bit here and there. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, there's this famous verb, I mean, in German discourse, right? Stop
Yeah.
Scholzing around, right? Which is a really derogatory way
Yeah.
of basically describing, all of Scholz's reluctance to take on a leadership position in Europe. So, especially with regard to military aid to Ukraine, because that was one of the biggest topics under discussion for the past year.
Yeah.
Um, and because, I mean, Scholz's idea basically is that other countries would have to lead first. So the United States and maybe France, right? They take the leadership, and then Germans would follow along. So I think that's sort of the idea. Um, and with regard to China, I think Scholz's main interest is to promote the German business community. Now,
Yeah.
from the perspective of Baerbock, I mean, wertegeleitete Außenpolitik, right? So the a values-based foreign policy.
Yeah.
Um,
It,
so I mean, when she came to power as a foreign minister, she said she's going to be a feminist. Right? It's going to be feminist foreign policy. It was the first
uh,
statement, right? And then the second statement is about the promotion of human rights generally, right? Now the thing is that Baerbock interprets the Taiwan issue as being a values-based issue. Right? So it's about defending the rule of law and democracy in Taiwan.
yeah.
And I mean, of course, if you make the comparison, yes, I mean, there's more rule of law and democracy in Taiwan than there is in mainland China. There's no doubt about that.
Mhm.
Um, now the thing is that if you wanted to have this values-based foreign policy, then you're gonna have to basically attack the Chinese position of threatening a military invasion in Taiwan, and say it much more forcefully, and saying that there's going to be negative consequences for China if they invaded Taiwan. Um, and this is clearly from the American perspective. I mean, that's what they want to hear, and that's what the Chinese don't want to hear, right?
Yeah.
And so, but then, okay, in the final analysis, I would still say that Baerbock has to be pragmatic. I mean, there's no other choice
Yeah,
on
definitely.
the German side. So she still visited, German, invested
Businesses.
factories in Beijing, right, in
Yeah.
China. Um, and um, and she could only use words to, you could say, warn the Chinese effectively, right? So the words would effectively be, um, you know, um, you shouldn't do it, right? But I mean, she wouldn't be able to
Yeah.
say that, the Bundeswehr would be, um, showing up in the Taiwan Straits.
Yeah, definitely a lot of moral signaling, uh, and I think it reflects maybe this German Green Party kind of move towards this pacifist, humanitarian, ecological emphasis. And you remember the Greens, third biggest party in Germany, and the Greens think that they could possibly maybe in place it's more significant role than the Social Democrats, and Habeck may run for chancellorship. So I maybe that's a move by her too. I don't know. Maybe it's a strategic move. So it's political. Obviously, it's political in nature, and this is reflected in foreign policy, which it shouldn't, like you rightly say. But it seems like it's also, political craftsmanship, I guess, if I use the phrase right.
Yeah,
Um,
there's a little bit of that.
messaging and um, this human rights agenda within the Green Party and this pacifism in the Green Party. Ironically, though, they were, if I remember, Anton Hofreiter, he's another major Green Party member. He actually was kind of for arming Ukraine. So maybe there's a reversal to this pacifism. The old Green values was very pacifistic, but now there seems to be a kind of realistic or maybe a turn that with the case of Ukraine, at least in Taiwan, maybe they're turning.
Well, it's a human rights based
Yeah,
framework, effectively.
yeah,
So, I
human
mean, the
rights.
idea is that, I mean, if you have the sovereignty violation from either Russia or China, then, by definition,
Yeah,
the human rights would be impinged, would be
yeah,
violated. And that if you wanted to maintain the standards of human rights, you'd have to defend the aggrieved party, which in this case would be Ukraine and Taiwan.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. So
so, so that's definitely what the logic is. And
yeah,
so I guess I think you were referencing the Richard David Precht argument in the podcast
yes, yeah, of
with
course.
Lance,
Mm.
where
Yeah, she went too far with this. Go ahead, go ahead. Maybe you summarize it differently. Go ahead. How
yeah,
I understood.
So Precht's argument was that um, that Baerbock was too rash and too self-assured, and that it doesn't make sense for a German politician to be lecturing Chinese.
Right.
Um, and so, but
Like an
Precht,
amateur. I think he uses the argument she's acting like an amateur or something, in foreign policy. You shouldn't do that in foreign policy, especially because it has risks for your country. It had risks that real serious ramifications if you go on alone and you make statements that are not fully thought through, and uh, you bring this passion into. You remember, she's a foreign minister. She's not, a different kind of minister. You know what I mean. I think that's the argument what Precht was making.
yeah, and also I
And,
mean, so Precht says that he has liberal values, so he's in favor
yeah,
of the values that Baerbock is defending. However, the best way to you know disseminate those values is through example, through emulation, right? So
yeah,
so just live your lifestyle, live out your values in your own country, and then if the Chinese grow to like the values that are lived in Germany, right, hypothetically,
hypothetically.
then there would be a spread of the German value system that would transfer to China. I mean, through osmosis, effectively, right, through a
Yeah,
natural transfer. Um, and that is sort
you
of
know,
the ideal state,
yeah,
rather than the moral lectures, right?
yeah.
Um,
Larry, I wonder what Baerbock, like I've seen her give speeches, and that it's part of her political rhetoric. And I think she was always kind of trained in a traditional way in Germany that you spew out your political values, all the time. And that becomes part of your rhetoric. And I think maybe she has difficulty in transitioning her previous role as a party leader, which was the Green Party, one of the leaders besides Habeck. They were two leaders, the Green Party. And now she's transitioning away from that political role of being a spokesperson almost to a real government role, foreign minister. I think that's what the difficulty is. I think the relearning your political communication, and you're moving from being a political spokesperson of a party to foreign minister. Maybe that's difficulty. What I'm observing, because it's sort of the political rhetoric style. You can tell is still sounds like a party leader. Not like a foreign minister. because the foreign minister would usually just deal with foreign policy, but you start bringing in back this party ideology, Green Party ideology, right? You can tell.
Now, what's interesting here is
Yeah.
that um, so I think the Chinese kind of also know that Baerbock's statement was targeted at the German audience, not at the Chinese audience, right?
Yes,
Um,
definitely.
and therefore, I mean, it's also noteworthy that Scholz and Baerbock did not travel together, right? So because then you would have had to agree on advancing the same rhetoric, the same political line. But the fact that when Scholz was visiting with the business delegation to have this one-day meeting with Xi Jinping, um, that was sort of the you could say the meat, of the German-China relations. That is to say, it was about promoting the German business community interests in China, and also the investments, the jobs, and so on and so forth. Um, and then when Baerbock was visiting, it was just to pose, so to speak, to the German audience. Um,
Mhm.
and, and I think the German government they almost do this on purpose, right? Where it's okay, we have these two factions in foreign policy in the government,
Uh,
and and we are pleasing both sides, right? So we are
yeah,
pleasing the business community because Scholz was not making any provocative statements. I mean, from the perspective of China, um, and so securing the German business interests in that way. And we're also pleasing the German human rights community
yeah,
because they
yeah,
get
well,
the Baerbock speeches, right? Um,
yeah.
so it's sort of like an all around, you could say,
Yeah,
you offer something to everybody, kind of,
yeah. I think that's a good way to put it. Yeah, yeah. And it also actually benefits the German Green Party base, like you say. I mean, it's political culture in Germany when you have a uh, self-described feminist foreign minister, and she is the first. No, excuse me, not the first. Joschka Fischer, Green Party. He was also foreign minister. So this she should be the second, but first woman. I believe first woman. Yeah, she would be the first female foreign minister. So she's definitely setting this profile image for future Green Party, kind of federal cabinet members or federal positions, which has often been challenging for a small party like the Greens. Now, the Greens are a bigger party in Germany, but when I look at other European countries, I think Austria is a special case. Austria has a green president, right? You'll have a green president. But think of where else, what other European countries there are hardly no green uh, politicians, and if politicians at a federal level, as far as I know. So this has been a big, yeah, obstacle. But also, so then that's probably the case that this is a unique opportunity, and this is Baerbock. She's probably also thinking about future candidates and profiling the Greens in this federal role, and want to make sure that they have a continuity of some sort after the next elections.
Yeah, I think that Baerbock's chances of being a chancellor are now very, very small. I mean, because she had the
Yeah,
one shot that she missed,
yeah.
right? So she was the chancellery
How
candidate
big? How
last
big? I
time.
could possibly, how big? Perhaps if there's some coalition building, but I don't know. Maybe she has another position role in the future elections. Maybe a different role. Interior. I don't know. This It's so challenging because the parties are so split sometimes in Germany, like it is in Austria, and elsewhere. So. But it's definitely difficult. Imagine, I mean, you're a Green Party, and they're put into this position of being a foreign minister, which historically was always either social democrat or a conservative. Rare cases that you've had a liberal in their position of foreign minister in Germany is really rare, right? But I don't know. Maybe it's just exceptionalism to the parliament, the way that German politics work. This necessity to have coalitions and all that, and right. So yeah,
Yeah, it's very complicated right now because it's the first time that you have three parties at the federal level. Now, I mean, at the
yeah,
state provincial level, I think you
yeah,
had quite a bit of experience with different combinations, but at the federal
yeah.
level, I think we have the first time
Ampel, yeah, the Ampel,
with the three parties. And yeah, and you have so many contradictory interests, right? I mean, you have the liberals that want, you know, pro-capitalists, pro-markets and everything. They want to promote the e-fuels, right?
yeah,
They want to push the combustion engine. I mean, to continue that with
nuclear
that
power, yeah,
industry.
yeah,
They want nuclear power. Then you have the Green Party that sort of doesn't want any of that. I mean, they want to have the decarbonization agenda effectively is going with solar and wind energy primarily, and then maybe a little bit of I think water vapor or something like that,
yeah,
hydrogen. Um, but and recently the Germans, they actually have shut down the the last nuclear power plants.
yeah.
I
Last
think
three,
in April. Yeah, yeah, that's right. Um, and and immediately you see an increase in the electricity prices. Now, I mean, I must assume like they have dealt with that contingency because right now, I mean, it was already less than whatever 5% or so, right? It was only a small portion of the energy grid that was covered by nuclear.
yeah.
Um,
I think renewables is 40% or higher. The statistics that I remember hearing in the Lons show was 40% renewable energies. That's how high they are now. Total use.
yeah, but
So,
we're also seeing an increase in coal, coal mining,
yeah,
coal plants, and that's going to
yeah,
run for a couple of more years.
yeah,
Because if you want to save on gas, and then you're shutting down all the nuclear plants, and it still takes time to build, the renewable sources. I mean, you're going to have a gap in energy supply, and the only way for you to fill the gap is by building coal plants. So
mhm,
I think that I think there was a lack of pragmatism on the German side, where I mean, as soon as you see this war, coming down your way, I mean, they wanted to shut down the nuclear plants back in January, right, this year, and then made a delay of that decision because of the contingency of that Ukraine war and the cutoff in gas supplies. Um, but I think that under these circumstances, I mean, I do agree with the conservative, the union, and the liberal
mhm.
perspective, um, which is to run the nuclear plants for just a bit longer. I mean, if it's a year or 2 years, I mean, basically up until the point when the, I mean, we already see floating LNG terminals um, in the north of Germany, right?
Yeah,
So those are ready. There might be a few more LNG projects that are going to be put in place. There's a discussion about, a Franco-German gas pipeline, which I think would be an interesting idea because it would, increase the Western supply of gas further. Um, and once you have that infrastructure set up fully in place within 2 or 3 years or so, then you can say, okay, shut down the remaining nuclear plants. Um,
yeah,
but anyway, I mean, but they did it so fast, so it's like, okay, well, Well, what they're also doing is, I mean, they're increasing purchases from neighboring countries. I mean, like,
Importing energy. Yeah.
yeah, like the Poles, for instance, they have excess coal energy. The Danes, they have the wind energy, right? So there's some extra sources that they can be supplied with. Um, I saw the Lance show
Oh yeah.
with the Schleswig-Holstein
Oh yeah.
transport minister. He's a Dane, actually. He's a
He's
Danish
got dual
descent.
citizenship. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um,
Well, he's talking about what they're talking about in that show is just trying to build a highway uh, that there's all sorts of legal appeals that citizens can make that stalls projects. And a lot of times this also stalls windmill projects because if there's a claim that like a little hamster is being threatened or one wild animal might go extinct, then it puts it in delay. And he was saying that Germany is this a case, unlike in Denmark, they can do these projects and it's a lot quicker. But in Germany, because you have these legal challenges that are made of such projects, it delays it by years. And just because, somebody claims that a hamster will be threatened, their ecosystem will be kind of destroyed when we build something, or um, so yeah, that was one of the arguments I followed in that show. It's
yeah, so
really
I mean, it
interesting.
seems to me that in Danish political culture, right? I mean, there's this idea of, communal well-being, right? And and if you are emphasizing communal well-being, by definition, you're always putting individual wills and desires, and you're submitting them to the community will. So in this case, I mean, if the idea is, okay, we have to build this highway, we have to build this windmill, even if it has an aesthetic or a personal impact in my neighborhood that I don't like, because now all the loud cars are zishing past my house, or the windmill starts to block my view of the beautiful coastline, or things like that, right?
Yeah,
That the Danes, they have this idea that the community is above the individual, um and yeah, that doesn't seem to exist in Germany. I think it's probably more about um you know if you have a complaint, you just wage your complaint, um
Yeah.
and then it just takes more time. I mean, and then you just have more bureaucracy. I mean,
Yeah.
and you're not able to do things quickly. I mean,
No,
the
yeah.
I saw in one of the talk shows, there's a Green Party mayor, Boris Palmer.
Oh yeah.
He's
Tübingen.
he's from Tübingen.
Oberbürgermeister. Yeah, Tübingen.
Yeah, and he was telling the story about um, obstacles to build solar panels in the municipality, because his idea is to use parking spots for cars as, you could say, solar panel stations, um, which would be nice because you don't have to find additional space where you could set up these panels, and it would provide a shade for the cars, especially during like warm
Summer.
days.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so it's an interesting idea, but he couldn't get a lot of these projects approved, um, precisely because of the paperwork that um, that he faces as a mayor, and then there's a lot of objections that are being raised by concerned locals. Yeah, and he's not able to realize his project, right?
that's crazy. Yeah.
It's still done by the
Mm.
bureaucracy. So yeah, it's a very weird kind of system. Um, right.
Yeah.
So you see, you were mentioning earlier about the Austrian elections. So there was something you wanted to discuss there. I mean, um, there have been several, I think, big elections that happened in Austria. I think there's going to be one in Salzburg that's going to come up, I believe, on Sunday. Um, there were, I think, there was one in Niederösterreich, and then there's
Uh-huh.
one in Canton and Carinthia. Um, and in Carinthia, I think they just repeat the same coalition, right? Which is
Was made up of
the
what
Conservative
party?
and the Social Democrat.
Like a
Um,
grand coalition, something
yeah, the
like that?
Grand Coalition.
Yeah.
And then in Niederösterreich, it's black and blue, right? So it's the
So
Conservative
the
and then the
populist.
Nationalists.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and uh, and so right now, I don't know what the coalition currently is in Salzburg. I think it might also be a grand coalition. I have a feeling.
Okay, okay. So no Greens at the government level. No, I guess they never made it that far.
I think there's one.
Municipality, I know municipality, but not at uh
Well, yeah,
Länder.
I think in Oberösterreich,
Okay, okay,
there might be the Green Party that is in
okay.
charge. Um,
All right. Yeah, that's interesting.
Oberösterreich. Let's
And you know, Berlin had the elections too, uh, which now will also be a grand coalition again between conservatives and social democrats. Berlin elections. Yeah.
Um, yeah, in Berlin, yeah. So there was a grand coalition government. I think they're doing that. Um, yeah, I mean, which was quite interesting because originally there was a election in 2021, right? But then they nullified the election
Oh
because
yeah,
of
there was too many.
irregularities.
Irregularities. Yeah.
Yeah.
They redid it, and then Social Democrats lost significant. They could have maintained a left Social Democrat left Green coalition, but they decided to just go with a Grand coalition. They had the numbers, but
Yeah,
they decided
there's
to.
a massive shift in sentiment. I think it has to do with crime in the city. So I
Yeah,
think
yeah,
there was a
yeah,
lot of concern that
exactly. Yeah,
because I think Berlin and Neukölln, right, there was
yeah.
riots that happened, especially among
During, yeah, yeah. There
like
was a
the
big
high
riot
migrant
there.
communities.
Yeah, yeah. That
Um,
was topic of many TV shows over there. I saw that. Yeah,
yeah, and then the problem is that like if you have like a fully left coalition, I mean, you know, so because they have this sort of like anti-racist discourse, right? Where basically they're saying, okay, we're so careful about being perceived as potential racists that, and even though it's a lot of people with migratory backgrounds, um, that are in fact committing crimes, um, then basically you're tying yourself down, right? I mean, you're not able to name the problem, so you can't do anything about it, right? Um, so
basically.
and so then what ends up happening, I mean, in this case, yeah, it was conservative, the CDU, right? They start talking about it, and then
yeah,
um and then yeah, and then they would get more votes, right?
yeah,
um
yeah.
and then that's why I find it very interesting what's happening in the Social Democratic Party in Austria, because
Hmm.
you have the local party politician Babler, Andreas Babler, and he's running now for the chairmanship of the party.
Huh.
Um, and so he's the mayor of a small town south of Vienna, which is called Traiskirchen. And Traiskirchen is the main town where it's a refugee hub. So when the refugees are coming in, they would be registered, and then they would be put into these um, into we could say a reception area, and the reception area, the biggest one, is in Traiskirchen, actually, which is a small-sized village. And it's quite interesting that even though there's a very high population density of refugees in his town, that mayor never engaged in, anti-migrant discourse, right? I mean, he was always saying that, the migrants, they're, if they stay here, I mean, they're gonna naturalize and they will have entitlement to live in that country. That the main challenge for the country is to find ways to integrate them into these communities. And which is quite interesting because the other challenger candidates, Doskosil, he's the provincial mayor, as the provincial governor in Burgenland, with an absolute majority, by the way. So his party governs by itself. And his aspiration is actually to be right wing on the migration policy, be right wing on the crime, because he was also a former police officer. And then in this way, he would presumably get a plurality of the vote, because he would draw voting support from the most popular party, which right now is the Freedom Party, the Nationalist Party. They're about 30% in the polls right now. And that's an interesting idea. I mean, and then the Babla idea is that no, actually, if you look at what people are really concerned about, it's not so much about getting rid of foreigners. They're concerned about bread and butter issues.
Yeah, inflation, right?
Yeah, it's about inflation. It's about subsidies for like housing that's been cut, and so you want to increase it again. It's about securing healthcare. It's about raising pay for teachers and for nurses and essential workers. It's about shortening the work hours. So he's in favor of the 32-hour work week, with basically a pay increase, right, to make up for the cuts in hours. So he's sort of extraordinarily popular among the rank and file. If you look at the events that he's organizing, it's always completely packed, right? He gives these. He's being Bernie Sanders effectively, right? I mean,
Oh, wow. Okay.
really
An Austrian version of Bernie
popular.
Sanders.
Yeah, he's that popular at the local level. Now the question is whether he's going to win that party internal election, and if he did, whether he's going to gain these percentage points, right? If he could cut the lead of the Freedom Party nationalists, if he can cut, let's say, 10% from the base, then the Social Democrats would go from 20% to 30%, right?
Okay.
So things like that. So that would be an interesting idea, and it's not been tried for quite a long time now, because for such a long time, I mean, there's neoliberal consensus, right? It's all about free markets, and then if you want to increase legitimacy a little bit, then you notch up the rhetoric on migration, right? So you talk about whatever, kicking out some refugees or something like that, right? And well, I mean, that was the FPO agenda. That was the OVP agenda, right? The Sebastian Kurz. Doskot Seal wants to basically do the same thing, right? And Babla is the first one who's like cutting against that narrative, right?
Okay. That's good.
So it's going to be an interesting struggle. I mean, whether that
when is the action coming up for that?
I think it's going to be in the second half of May.
Okay.
Um,
I'll follow it. Yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
and then the party congress is going to be at the beginning of June. Um, so in the party congress, that's when they will have the formal vote, and that's the vote that counts, right?
Okay.
Um,
I'll
and
follow it.
yeah, yeah, we'll see what comes out of that political struggle. Um, Now, I had a discussion recently with an economic expert, and he says that what makes it so difficult to pursue genuine social democratic agenda is the lack of capital controls. Because you can have the capitalists whenever they feel like they're threatened by, socialist policies, they can just withhold the capital. And back after World War II, they had these capital controls where they made sure that the capitalists couldn't just withdraw the capital.
Mm.
And that's what China still has. That's why I said, non-convertible currency, which means that they still have the capital controls.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
and but the problem is, like, most European countries got rid of any capital controls,
Right.
and
The
I don't think you
problems.
would be able to go back to that anyways because it's EU law, right? So yeah,
Free market. Yeah. Yeah. Unless it violates EU law, EU principles. Uh, Surprisingly, if you don't follow what happened in the news, you hear about this Ukrainian wheat transport, and Poland, I think, tried to stop it or something, or created laws, and the EU is getting involved there. Um, yeah, so yeah, so sometimes the EU gets involved if it thinks it violates, its market principles, or if
yeah.
a nation state goes outside of its purview, I don't know, but I'm following that right now in the news. There's apparently something with Poland stopping the Ukrainian wheat imports, and Hungary too. I think Hungary is trying the same. Uh, so they're worried about the wheat dumping the prices too low, and that they're worried that they will ruin the domestic farms, and so they did protectionism, and so now the EU is going after this. Uh, these two countries, Hungary and Poland. So I don't know what will happen. I'll follow it like you. I don't. Um, yeah, we'll see what happens. But yeah, that's
Yeah,
anything.
so uh,
Yeah.
right, I'm not sure what the EU ruling has been on this particular issue yet, but I must
Yeah.
assume they will intervene.
Yeah. We
Yeah,
usually
so you
will.
have right-wing governments in Poland and Hungary, and Poland is very strongly pro-Ukraine, um,
Yeah.
but Hungary is not so much. But yeah, but they have to serve the domestic constituency, which is the
Yeah.
local farmers. The Ukrainians, they are the wheat super producers, not just in Europe but in the world, right? The world production, because the the soil, like I think it's like a black soil, um,
Uh-huh.
in Ukraine, which is basically the most fertile land in the world, right? That you can have. So so they would clearly outproduce
Yeah.
the the Central Eastern European producers. Um, and so yeah, there's concerns, but then it's a problem because because if you don't allow the Ukrainians to sell the wheat, elsewhere, I mean, especially in Central Eastern Europe, then the Ukrainians are not able to generate foreign exchange.
Yeah.
And without the foreign exchange, I mean, it's very hard to fund the war. I mean, so right now, I mean, the Ukrainian budget already earmarks, I think, half of the government spending on the military, right? And then the remaining government budget would go to, teacher salaries, doctor salaries, And of course, you need the doctors during the war because there's a lot of injured soldiers, right? Um,
Yeah, it's
so
so,
right now, I mean, the Ukrainians are limping along because the you know American budget support, Canadian, European, right?
yeah, lots of money, yeah, involved.
Yeah,
Definitely, yeah.
and we'll see. I mean, they're gonna have to make a very big blow. They're receiving a lot of weapons right now for the counteroffensive. There's like over 1,000 tanks apparently that are being
Wow.
um, readied up now for what's going to be a big strike effectively, and I mean, we'll see how successful they're going to be with that. Um, so and also you mentioned the Elon Musk thing, the Chat
oh
GPT.
yeah. Well, of course, I'm following now, whether the mission was success or failure, now it's being, reframed as a success still. I don't know. So but apparently, this worry, concern about privatized space exploration or privatized, billionaire financed or billionaire uh, involvement in space industry, I guess you could call it. And I don't know, maybe it's still very risky. I don't know. My impression with it seems very risky, and the failures is just accumulated. Uh, and I don't know if it's just this particular, private space organization known as SpaceX, or I don't know. So I'm kind of torn, you know. It seems NASA seems more successful with just public funded space exploration programs, including the European Space Agency. I mean, they now have sent they're sending something to Jupiter that's going to take 7 years, but I just don't understand this whole idea of privatizing, space industry, and we see failure after failure, and it's just a big cash cow, it seems to me. So I don't know how much was lost. I don't know. I was looking at the stock too, SpaceX stock.
It was about an explosion of the SpaceX
Yeah.
rockets, right?
Yeah, yeah, it exploded. But see, now the narratives are changing. Now I was watching the news, and oh, it was supposed to explode, and so I don't know what to believe now. First they're saying it's success, not a success. They're saying it's a failure. Now they're saying it's a success. That it was intended to explode, which I feel that's really odd.
Well, there's
Yeah,
obviously a commercial interest, right? I mean, so
yeah. There's a
because
lot of
I
money
must
tied up.
assume the media takes the cue from the SpaceX press release, right?
Yeah, but again, yeah, like I'm very critical because we don't know the oversight. There's a lot of money pumped into it, and you know, Elon Musk is the star. I mean, he's the CEO of not just SpaceX, Tesla, and Twitter now. So I don't know. Maybe he should focus on one thing. And I don't know. Maybe it's again. I'm not trying to do any bashing on a person, but like I don't know. Maybe it's such a big thing to do, and it's space exploration and getting involved with this stuff. It's very technical. I'm not expert in this area whatsoever, but it seems like from an organizational standpoint, that there's a lot of hype in this idea of privatized space exploration. Sometimes it seems successful, but my impression is it's failure. Did it have Falcon? Did it have the Falcon capsules, right? Those were successful, but maybe just the whole rocket business, especially
Yeah,
the big rock, the big Bertha. What do you call those big rockets down in Texas? So yeah,
yeah. I think there was a Wall Street Journal article. It was about that one village that's in Texas, close to the Mexican border. It's on the Gulf of Mexico, right? And yeah, I mean it's basically a company town, right? So the entire village actually kind of belongs to SpaceX, to Elon Musk, so that he can freely operate his space program experiments. But okay, so I don't know how to read into this particular
Yeah.
event, this explosion, but I would say that what he's doing is not easy, right? To
Agreed. Yeah, it's very challenging.
it's not sort of like an everyday thing where you can launch dozens of rockets and only one of them has to work. These are very expensive undertakings. I do get your point that NASA should probably um, take over more responsibilities. However, I think that NASA funds a lot of the
Yeah.
SpaceX operations, because it's effectively outsourcing. I mean, that's the whole idea of, I suppose, neoliberalism, right? Using state money to fund private enterprise. Um, and yeah, anyway, so
Uh,
yeah, what Musk is doing is not a simple endeavor. So I
yeah.
respect him for a lot of the projects that he has in the pipeline. I mean, including Tesla electric cars, right? And then also, yeah, the open AI stuff that he's also involved with, at least financially. And yeah, then Twitter, which, I mean, you could say, well, was this a good acquisition on his end? Um, I'm not sure about. I mean, whether the quality of Twitter has improved a lot, but certainly, I mean, he has a lot of things on his plate, and he's a very ambitious person. I mean, it's kind of rare to see this in a person. There's this one statement
Yeah.
that he made regarding ChatGPT, which I found was quite interesting because he was one of the co-founders and funders of the OpenAI GPT project,
Mm.
where he said that there should be a moratorium for 6 months about about ChatGPT and similar products, because we could get to a point where the pace at which AI gets developed is way too fast for our societies to handle.
Okay, yeah. Respond.
Yeah, because okay, so there's a critical threshold from controlled AI to autonomous AI, right? So right now, I mean, it seems to me that ChatGPT is still controlled AI, right? Because you're typing in a prompt and it will give you an output, but there's no output without input, right? So you have to input a prompt. The the threshold towards super intelligence is not very far off. It is going to be reached at the point where the algorithm starts to make its own decisions autonomously. And you can maybe initially program in some of the values, like the human values that we care about, right? Um, but it will get to a point of, like, imagine like a universal surveillance state where there were already attempts by governments already to implement those programs, like for instance, the COVID vaccine passport, right? Which is an idea that fortunately many governments scrapped again. But some countries, they were like, yeah, okay, we want to have that. We want to mandate everybody to take the vaccine, right? So,
Great new world.
yeah, Brave New
Yeah.
World. I mean, if we cross to that level from controlled AI to autonomous AI, um, Yeah, I saw this podcast, Lex Friedman, and this is one AI expert. I forgot his name, but he was talking about the alignment problem, right, in AI research. So the alignment basically means, is the AI going to be aligned with human values? Right. The most important human value is basically survival, right? We don't want AI to kill us. Now the problem is that at the point at which you cross the threshold from controlled AI to autonomous AI, what if the AI was deciding that humans on this planet is going to be a net negative, just from a computational perspective or logical perspective? Um, it's a statement that, of course, we as humans would never agree with, but what if the AI came to that conclusion? Would we still be able, before that happens, to push the stop button?
Hmm.
Does a
Like
stop
this.
button exist?
That's a good point. Yeah. Reverse it, you mean?
Yeah, I mean,
Or
and the
disavow it.
idea,
Pull the plug. Mm.
pull the plug. And what's so scary about the autonomous AI thing is that we only have one shot to get it right. I mean, if you think about any prior inventions, like let's say if you build the car for the first time, like in the early 20th century, right? There's going to be a lot of false starts,
Yeah.
right? There's going to be like you mess up the way how the engine is being built, and then the engine doesn't run, so you change some of the components in the engine so that maybe it works next time, etc. The problem with autonomous AI is that there's not a lot of room for trial and error, because if we cross the threshold into autonomous AI, there might not be any stop button for us to push before the algorithms decide to kill us. So that's
So it's fair to say AI is a manufactured risk, right? In the technical sense, it is a real manufactured risk. We manufacture a potential risk when, like you said, we're moving from controlled AI to autonomous AI. That can be a risk, but we haven't considered realizing the risk yet.
yeah, and then the
Uh,
problem is
well,
like,
I'm kind of going. Go ahead. I'm kind of trying to go to the risk society thing, but maybe Ulrich Beck. I wonder what he would have said to this. It's not alive anymore, but he would have probably said, "I told you so."
yeah, it
You
is a huge risk. It is a huge
Yeah,
risk that we're exposing our
definitely.
societies to. And the problem is also the logic of adoption, right? And what
Mm.
I mean by that is, so a lot of policy actions in the American political discourse are framed in terms of the Cold Wars, right? So basically, we have to do X because we're in competition with China,
All right.
you know, and then if we don't do it, then they will do it, and they beat us, right? So that right now is a logic, right? The Cold War logic, right? And
Yeah.
the trouble is then with AI, right? When the Americans are saying, if we don't develop AI, then the Chinese will. And the Chinese are saying, if we don't develop AI, then the Americans will.
Yeah.
And the idea on each side is to say, if we develop AI first, we will control, whatever markets, societies, organizations, the global public sphere, whatever, right? And now, historically speaking, we know that competition is what drives the progress. I mean, there's absolutely zero doubt about it. I mean, one of the reasons that the Europeans were able to dominate the world was because they faced enormous internal competition, right? It was the Germans versus the French versus the Russians versus the British versus the Swedish versus, Italians, etc., right? So we know historically that competition means progress. It's always been this way. Now, the problem is that if we're using sort of, you could say, our chimp behaviors, right, which is basically the application of competition in order to drive progress, it basically means that there will absolutely be no stop button for the development of AI. Right? Because I mean, even let's say, okay, so Elon Musk says, okay, we should stop AI for a couple of months, right, or for a year or whatever.
Yeah.
And then let's say he convinces Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, to comply with that. But guess what? I mean, there's like hundreds of AI companies in this economy, right? And they're like, wow, we could take this GPT algorithm and we could jigger it around a little bit, and then we can, develop it ourselves. So,
Definitely a risk, yeah.
yeah, I mean, and the way how a system is structured, it's like there's no risk mitigation, right? I mean, the only risk mitigation potential we have is if things go wrong and the regulators can still step in. Right? I mean, that would be that's kind of the hope that we have right now.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't it that same issue if they started to use algorithm or AI even in financial trading, or just letting computers do it, trying to uh, do this kind of betting, on the stock market? Isn't that already done partially? That the concern is if you allow, this algorithms to take over and have AI essentially control the decision on trading of stocks or shares. Then imagine with some big, hedge fund company already uses it, and that could, possibly have ramifications, for the financial system. I mean, because it could definitely be a major risk. So I can see this infecting definitely different sectors of our economy, financial sector, manufacturing, and even fast food. To what extent will AI, start to change the fast food industry, and more automation, more and more technologies that we don't know the risks yet, the hidden risks. Even like predicting behavior. I think we have AI art, we have AI construction of paintings. I've seen it. It's amazing. It's really close to reality. It's constructing a new kind of reality. So
Yeah.
yeah,
So
even the movie industry will be. I'm sure the movie industry will definitely be affected. All those people and
yeah, do you have to
like,
actually hire actors, right?
yeah, you wouldn't have to hire actors. You won't have to. I mean, if you're a hedge fund, you could just have some sophisticated AI, and those are your financial advisors. I mean, they would be replaced, and they would do the betting on stocks. You know, and so they would
Yeah, I also
essentially.
saw like
Yeah.
a contract lawyer recently who was using ChatGPT, and he shared his experience on Twitter. Um, and so so you have to have some knowledge of contract law in order to write the prompt, right? So you have to know, like, certain laws in the legal code, like legal language, right, to look up, right? Um, and and then you can type a good prompt. But then with that prompt, which is basically 3 or 4 bullet points, you could write whole contracts in seconds, right? And so that clearly is a version of automation. And then the other things, computer coding, right? Because the neoliberals keep telling us, learn to code, right? And you have computer coders who are able to punch in the prompts to write a whole script. The script is a computer program, effectively, right? Which is
so
what you
AI
do as a
could get.
software engineer.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. AI could get as sophisticated to write like actual computer code. It could already do that, like C++, or I don't know what the computer Pascal.
Yeah,
What is
yeah,
computer language? It could actually write it.
yeah.
Wow.
And so a lot of the inefficiencies of, like, if you work in computer engineering teams, is like if the engineers are using different computer language, right? Python, C++,
Yeah.
Java, then you have,
Yeah.
and then among data science, right, you have like the R and the Python camp, right? So now the GPT is able to translate computer code.
Oh, wow.
So you can write computer code in the language that you learned, in the computer language you learned, and then you can have it translated to basically to produce the equivalent commands in other languages, and then you can share those scripts with your coworkers who basically native to their coding language, right? And right, so that's about increasing efficiency, rather than replacing workers. Yeah, but an AI art, you just mentioned that. I mean, so if you're a graphic designer for like movies or like video games, things like that. Um, yeah, the BBC reporter I was watching, they were already saying that there's graphic designers who are losing their jobs. They're not receiving callbacks
Mm.
from video game companies because they found AI was cheaper.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, so that's why I think. Okay, so that's why I mean, okay, maybe this is close to the end of the podcast. So
Yeah.
that's why I think we should end on the note of the leisure society again, right? And
Mm.
why is it so important to emphasize the that we have to move in the direction of leisure society. Again,
Basic income guarantee, right?
yeah, it would have to
Which is part
happen.
of the leisure, which is part of leisure society, right? It would have to have some universal UBI
Yeah,
component.
it very much fits together. I mean, but then
Yeah.
I don't know. I heard this. I was listening to this podcast with Max Techmark. He's one of these like MIT visionaries. And he was saying that he's very pessimistic. Actually, like we've never been able to create a society where if most of the people are the useless class, right, from a societal economic standpoint, where you could just let them live, right? I mean, there could be the fear where the rulers want to, you know, basically eliminate the idle population. Um, and so that's sort of like the dystopian framing, right? Where at the point
Yeah.
where people are made useless, I mean, it's like do the powerful want to keep the so-called useless people around, right? I mean, even having the discourse of, I get to be useful, I get to be part of the 1% that's of the population that's still does something useful, like, overseeing the robots or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so it could there could be a very dystopian future, basically. So that's simply the
Yeah,
key
yeah.
point.
Sounds right. Yeah. So you're saying on a closing note, you're saying leisure society is important. So we move away from this idea that um, that work is a necessity, that AI will eliminate work one day. We'll have to come to terms to a post-work leisure society. Work as we understand it, now.
Yeah.
In this time that we live, that's how, yeah. We have to
Yeah.
transition from it. Yeah. Yeah,
So I
good.
mean,
Yeah.
in my recent blog, I mean, I made this,
Yeah.
which was about the Chat GPT, where I used my own example of the blog writing process, where
Yeah.
you could make the argument that why do I not just type in a prompt and it will spit out, like, a 2,000 word blog post, right? Citing all the sources and bringing in all the evidence to create the argument, and et cetera, et cetera. Why do I ostentatiously waste my time, the 2 or 3 days that it takes me to write the blog posts, to, craft the sentences, to craft the ideas, to, do the background reading and so on and so forth? Well, I'm doing this, because what else would I do with my time, more or less, right? I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, as a human being, I mean, you have to ask yourself, like, you have given amount of hours during the day, and you have to decide how to spend it with, right? And the things that you choose to spend the most time with, right? Which is, I suppose, writing, writing, reading. Um, in my case, but for everybody, it's going to be something different. Um, well, that's going to be the skill that you're honing, that you want to be better at,
Your
regardless
craft.
of, yeah,
Yeah.
it's a craft. I mean, regardless of how good AI is going to be able to do it.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, because it's not wage labor, right? I'm not receiving a wage for it, so I'm not worried about, you know, performance indicators, right?
Mhm.
I'm just worried
It
about,
has value in itself. Yeah, it has
right.
value in itself. Yeah,
Yeah, I
definitely.
mean,
Yeah.
I'm worried about honing the craft, um, because obviously, like, I mean, it helps me in other domains. I mean, if I'm able to write a blog post and I'm able to, have discussions with friends and colleagues about
Definitely.
complex topics, right? So it helps me in other domains of life for sure. But versus, if technically, I mean, if all I did was being a prompt writer and I could churn out thousands of blog posts, I mean, well, then the big question is, well, first of all, who's going to read it in the first place?
Mm. What's
And
I
I'm
would
not
say
going to enjoy it
Brecht,
as much.
yeah, Brecht would say, what's the sin of it all? What's the purpose, right? It has to have some sin. Yeah, sin,
It has a
purpose.
purpose. Yeah, has a purpose.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So and that's why we're doing these things. I mean,
that's right.
you could also make the. I mean, are you familiar with, like, the fictitious Joe Rogan
Uh,
podcast with Steve Jobs?
no, no, I need
It
to
was
watch that.
it's on YouTube, but it's completely fictitious, right? So they never encountered each other.
Uh-huh.
Steve Jobs has passed away over 10 years ago.
Right.
Um, but it was an AI generated podcast, basically, by fusing basically the voice recordings of both men, and then sort of generating text, and then over which both
Crazy,
voices speak.
crazy. Yeah,
Um,
that's crazy.
and so, I mean, of course, like, you could have an AI generated podcast of, Larry and Mike, and with their with our
Well,
podcast,
200
right?
years from now, right? They'll use us as pods or something.
Yeah, but it could be feasible. So then the question would be, well, why the hell are we wasting our time, right, having this conversation, right?
It has to go on
Uh,
the record. We have to have some record of our existence, you know.
yeah. Well, I mean, and well,
Uh,
again, but it's the same point again, right? It's like, we're doing this as a craft. We're doing this for enjoyment. It's not about efficiency. It's not about performance.
yeah, it's
Uh,
always amazing talking to you.
yeah,
Always learn so much.
yeah. It's very insightful. But yeah, hope to do this again. And
All
but
right.
thank you very much, Mike, for
Yep.
uh
Okay.
coming on. And
Wrong button.